The Grand Hyatt's conference hall buzzed with the electric tension that only comes before a political storm. Crystal chandeliers cast harsh shadows across rows of expectant faces, while television cameras positioned like silent sentinels captured every breath, every gesture, every micro-expression that might become tomorrow's headlines. The air itself seemed thick with ambition and anticipation. Zohran Mamdani adjusted his navy tie and surveyed the crowd from his position at the mahogany panel table. At 32, he was easily the youngest participant in this year's Future of America conference, a fact that both energized and intimidated him. Corporate executives in $1,000 suits whispered among themselves, their eyes occasionally drifting toward him with barely concealed curiosity. Who was this young assemblyman from Queens, and what was he doing among the titans of American politics? The answer sat 3 chairs away. Donald Trump's entrance had transformed the room's energy like a lightning strike. Cameras swiveled toward him as he strode to his seat, his signature red tie cutting through the sea of muted grays and blues. The former and current president moved with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his right to occupy any space he entered. His presence seemed to expand beyond his physical form, commanding attention even in silence. Ladies and gentlemen, the moderator, veteran journalist Margaret Chen, called the room to order. Today we examine the future of American economic policy through the voices of experience and renewal. Her emphasis on the final word wasn't lost on anyone present. Mamdani felt the weight of representation settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. He thought of his parents, Kashmira and Zohran Sr., who had fled Uganda with nothing but hope and landed in Queens with determination. His father's calloused hands from 18-hour shifts driving a taxi. His mother's proud smile when he'd graduated law school. They weren't here physically, but their sacrifices lived in every word he was about to speak. Assemblyman Mamdani, Chen's voice cut through his reverie, you've been vocal about what you call economic justice. Please elaborate for our audience. Rising slowly, Mamdani felt the room's focus narrow to a laser point. 300 pairs of eyes, millions more watching the livestream. This was his moment. Thank you, Margaret. His voice carried clearly across the hall, steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. When I speak of economic justice, I'm talking about a fundamental American principle that seems to have gotten lost in translation. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the audience. In the front rows, young activists leaned forward eagerly. Further back, older attendees sat with arms crossed, their skepticism practically radiating from their postures. We live in a nation where we've somehow normalized what I call corporate socialism, a system where we socialize losses and privatize profits. The phrase landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of murmurs throughout the hall. Trump shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the table's surface. The gesture was subtle, but Mamdani caught it in his peripheral vision. My parents came to this country with $800 and a suitcase, Mamdani continued, his voice gaining warmth as he spoke of his family. They believed in the American promise, that hard work and determination could build a better life. And they were right. But they succeeded despite a system rigged against them, not because of it. He turned slightly toward Trump, not addressing him directly but ensuring his words carried in that direction. While my father worked 16-hour days to keep his small taxi business afloat, paying every tax and fee required, massive corporations were receiving billions in taxpayer subsidies. Tell me, which of these represents the American way? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and persistent. Several audience members nodded, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Trump's fingers stopped drumming. His eyes, which had been casually scanning the room, now fixed on Mamdani with laser intensity. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. That's a beautiful story, Assemblyman, Trump's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Really touching. But fairy tales don't run economies. Mamdani smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both gracious and razor-sharp. You're absolutely right, Mr. President. Fairy tales don't run economies. Neither do fantasy tax policies that pretend wealth automatically trickles down to working families. A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the progressive section of the audience. Trump's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Let's talk numbers, Mamdani continued, his tone shifting from personal to professorial. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 promised to boost wages and create jobs. Instead, it delivered the largest transfer of wealth from working families to corporations in American history. Companies used their tax savings for stock buybacks, not worker raises. He gestured toward a large screen that had been dormant until now. Suddenly, it flickered to life with real-time social media feeds showing the debate's live-stream view count climbing rapidly: 2.3 million, 2.4 million, 2.5 million. The sight of those numbers changed something fundamental in the room's dynamics. This wasn't just a policy discussion anymore, it was a performance being judged by an invisible jury of millions. Trump noticed the screen too, and Mamdani watched his posture shift from casual dismissal to focused attention. The stakes had just been raised, and everyone present felt it. "You know what's funny about socialist accusations?" Mamdani said, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that somehow made his words more cutting. "They usually come from people who've spent their careers benefiting from government intervention, just the kind that flows upward instead of down." The progressive section of the audience erupted in applause, while conservative attendees sat in stony silence. Margaret Chan gripped her moderator's cards tighter, sensing the conversation spiraling beyond her control. "Mr. President," Mamdani continued, turning to face Trump directly for the first time, "you've built your career on government contracts, tax incentives, and regulatory favor. When Wall Street collapsed in 2008, we nationalized their losses while they kept their profits. But heaven forbid we suggest nationalizing healthcare to save working families from bankruptcy." The words landed like physical blows. Trump's face flushed red, his hands clenching into fists on the table. The careful political theater of the moment was dissolving into something rawer, more dangerous. "The real question," Mamdani pressed on, his voice rising slightly, "is why caring about working families gets you labeled a radical, while transferring trillions to the wealthy gets you called a fiscal conservative?" The live stream counter hit 4.8 million viewers. Social media notifications buzzed on phones throughout the audience like electronic cicadas. Hashtags were forming in real time: hashtag corporate socialism, hashtag economic justice, hashtag debate night. Trump stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. Every camera swiveled toward him, every reporter's pen poised over paper. The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. "Enough of this nonsense." Trump's voice boomed across the hall, his carefully maintained political persona cracking like old paint. His finger pointed directly at Mamdani, trembling with barely controlled fury. The young assemblyman remained seated, his hands folded calmly on the table, his expression serene despite the storm brewing 3 feet away. The contrast was striking: youth versus age, calm versus chaos, the future challenging the past. Margaret Chan leaned forward, her moderator instincts kicking in. "Gentlemen, let's maintain," but Trump cut her off with a gesture, his attention laser-focused on the young man who had just systematically dismantled his economic legacy in front of millions of viewers. "Shut your mouth, communist." The words exploded across the hall like a thunderclap, followed by absolute, deafening silence. Even the constant clicking of camera shutters ceased, as if the entire room had collectively held its breath. Mamdani sat perfectly still, his dark eyes meeting Trump's furious gaze without flinching. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth, not triumphant, but knowing. As if this moment had been inevitable from the second head walked into the room. The live stream counter hit 6.2 million viewers and climbing. In the silence that followed, everyone present understood that something fundamental had just shifted in American political discourse. The mask of civility had fallen away, revealing the raw power struggle beneath. And in this moment, with millions watching, the future would respond to the past's challenge. Zohran Mamdani slowly began to rise from his chair. The silence stretched like a taut wire across the Grand Hyatt's conference hall. 6.2 million people watched through screens around the world as Zohran Mamdani rose slowly from his chair, each movement deliberate and measured. The chandeliers above seemed to dim, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Trump remained standing, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled emotion, his pointing finger still extended like an accusation frozen in time. The red flush on his face had deepened, spreading down his neck and disappearing beneath his starched collar. Margaret Chan gripped her moderator card so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her decades of experience covering political events had never prepared her for a moment quite like this. The carefully choreographed nature of modern political discourse had just shattered into 1,000 pieces, and she wasn't sure if she should intervene or simply document history unfolding. In the audience, phones buzzed incessantly. Social media notifications created a digital symphony of chimes, alerts, and vibrations that somehow made the human silence even more profound. Reporters typed frantically on their devices, their fingers flying over screens as they raced to capture the moment that everyone knew would define careers and change trajectories. Mamdani straightened his shoulders and smoothed his tie with hands that showed not the slightest tremor. His dark eyes swept across the room, taking in the sea of frozen faces, some horrified, some fascinated, all transfixed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly through the hall's acoustics, each word deliberate and weighted. "Mr. President," he began, his tone so calm it seemed almost conversational, "thank you." The unexpected response sent a visible ripple through the audience. Several people leaned forward, straining to hear what would come next. Trump's pointing finger wavered slightly, confusion flickering across his features. "Thank you," Mamdani repeated, taking a step forward, "for showing the American people exactly what we're dealing with." Before Trump could respond, a voice rang out from the audience, clear, strong, and unexpected. An elderly woman in the third row had stood up, her silver hair catching the light, her posture ramrod straight despite her age. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Excuse me." Margaret Chen turned toward the interruption, her moderator instincts warring between maintaining order and recognizing that something significant was happening. "Ma'am, this is a panel discussion. My name is Dorothy Martinez," the woman continued, ignoring the attempted interruption. Her voice grew stronger with each word. "My son was Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, United States Army." The room's energy shifted again, this time toward something deeper and more solemn. Several veterans in the audience sat up straighter, recognizing the weight in her words. "Miguel believed in this country," Dorothy continued, her voice steady but emotion threading through each syllable. "He believed in the Constitution, in freedom of speech, in the right of every American to be heard in the halls of power." She turned to face Trump directly, her elderly frame somehow commanding despite its diminutive size. "My son gave his life defending the principle that in America, we debate ideas, we don't silence voices. He died believing that democracy means listening to those who disagree with us, not ordering them to be quiet." The silence that followed was different from before, not shocked, but reverent. Even Trump's aggressive posture seemed to deflate slightly in the face of a Gold Star mother's quiet dignity. Mamdani felt the moment's weight settling around him like a mantle. This was no longer about economics or politics or even personal confrontation. This had become about the very soul of American discourse. "Mrs. Martinez," he said softly, inclining his head toward her with deep respect. "Your son's service honors us all." She nodded once, tears glistening in her eyes, then sat back down. But her intervention had fundamentally changed the room's dynamics. What had been a political spectacle was now something larger, a test of democratic values under pressure. Mamdani turned back to Trump, his expression somehow both compassionate and resolute. "You called me a communist, Mr. President. I want to tell you what I actually am." He walked around the table, moving closer to the center of the room, his voice gaining warmth and power. "I am the son of refugees who fled dictatorship in Uganda. My parents arrived at JFK Airport with $800, 2 suitcases, and a fierce belief in American democracy. The livestream counter hit 8 million viewers, but nobody was watching it anymore." The room was transfixed by the young man's quiet intensity. "My father, Zohran Sr., worked 18 hours a day driving a taxi through Queens and Manhattan. Not because he loved the work, but because he loved what the work represented, the chance to build something better for his children." Mamdani's voice took on a storyteller's cadence, painting pictures with words. "He would come home at midnight, his hands stained with coffee and his back aching from sitting behind the wheel. But he would always ask about my homework, always remind me that education was the bridge between who we were and who we could become." Several audience members were nodding now, recognizing their own family stories in his words. The American experience of struggle and hope, of sacrifice and possibility, transcended political boundaries. My mother, Kashmira, cleaned office buildings before dawn and attended English classes at night. She learned this country's language not because she was ashamed of her own, but because she understood that communication builds bridges. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room again. Communist? No, sir. I am the product of American determination, American opportunity, and American values. I am what happens when this country keeps its promises to those who believe in its potential. The applause started slowly in the progressive section, then spread through the center of the room. Even some conservative attendees found themselves clapping, moved despite their political disagreements. Trump shifted uncomfortably, his earlier fury giving way to something more complex. The simple narrative he had tried to construct, young radical versus experienced leader, was crumbling under the weight of Mamdani's lived experience. You want to know what I believe in? Mamdani continued, his voice rising slightly. I believe in the America that gave my family a chance. I believe in the America that says your success should be determined by your effort, not your inheritance. I believe in the America that Dorothy Martinez's son died defending, a place where ideas matter more than insults. He gestured toward the audience, including everyone in his vision. The real question isn't whether I'm a communist. The real question is this: what kind of country do we want to be? Mamdani turned to face the cameras directly, speaking now not just to the room but to the millions watching worldwide. Do we want to be a country where disagreement leads to dialogue, or to demands for silence? Do we want leaders who answer tough questions, or who try to intimidate those who ask them? The energy in the room was building like electricity before a storm. People were leaning forward, hanging on every word. Even the journalists had stopped typing, caught up in the moment. Mr. President, Mamdani said, turning back to Trump with something that looked almost like pity in his eyes, you had the chance to engage with my ideas, to debate my proposals, to show the American people what leadership looks like under pressure. He spread his hands wide, palms up, in a gesture of openness. Instead, you chose to silence rather than persuade. You chose insult rather than argument. You chose the tools of authoritarianism rather than democracy. The room erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and scattered boos. The careful political theater of the morning had completely dissolved into something rawer and more authentic. Trump's face had gone through several color changes during Mamdani's response, cycling from red to pale and back again. His mouth opened and closed several times, as if he were struggling to find words that could match the young assemblyman's eloquence. That's not. Trump began, but his usual command of crowd dynamics seemed to have deserted him. The simple attack that had worked for him countless times before had been turned into something larger and more damaging. Mamdani raised his hand slightly, not cutting Trump off but indicating he had more to say. The gesture was respectful but firm, the kind of quiet authority that couldn't be shouted down. I want to end with this, he said, his voice growing softer but somehow more compelling. My parents didn't come to America for easy answers or simple solutions. They came for the right to participate in complex conversations about difficult problems. He looked directly at Trump, then at Dorothy Martinez, then at the cameras. That's what democracy looks like. Not perfect, not always comfortable, but always committed to the principle that every voice deserves to be heard and every idea deserves to be examined. The live stream counter hit 10 million viewers, but the numbers had become irrelevant. Something fundamental had shifted in American political discourse, and everyone in that room, and watching around the world, could feel it. Mamdani took a step back toward his seat, then paused. Oh, and Mr. President? My parents taught me to always thank people who help me make my point. So thank you again. You've just shown America exactly why the next generation is ready to lead. The standing ovation that followed seemed to last forever. The standing ovation seemed to stretch through time itself, wave after wave of applause cascading through the Grand Hyatt's conference hall like a thunderstorm that refused to pass. Zohran Mamdani stood quietly at the center of it all, his hands clasped behind his back, watching as even some of the most conservative attendees found themselves on their feet. Trump remained frozen at his position, his face cycling through expressions like a man watching his carefully constructed world reorganize itself in real time. The pointing finger had long since dropped to his side, and his usual arsenal of comebacks seemed to have deserted him entirely. Margaret Chen seized the moment to regain some semblance of control. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called into her microphone, her voice barely cutting through the sustained applause. "If we could please," she was interrupted by a sharp chime from the main screen, followed by a notification that made the entire room fall silent. The live stream viewership counter had just crossed 15 million viewers, making it the most watched political debate in streaming history. But more importantly, social media analytics were flooding across the bottom of the screen in real time. #ShutUpCommunist was trending worldwide, but not in the way anyone had expected. The hashtag had been co-opted, transformed from an insult into a rallying cry. Thousands of Americans were posting their own stories of immigrant families, of working-class struggles, of economic injustice. Screenshots of Mamdani's quotes were being shared faster than the algorithms could track them. The phrase "thank you for showing America exactly what we're dealing with" had already become a meme. A young tech journalist in the audience held up his phone, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet hall. "Mr. President, you're trending on Twitter, but, well, you might want to see this." Trump's campaign manager, seated in the front row, was frantically typing on his own device, his face growing paler with each swipe. The digital landscape was reshaping itself in real time, and traditional political calculations were becoming obsolete by the minute. Mamdani noticed the shift in energy and decided to lean into it. "You know what's remarkable about this moment?" he said, his voice conversational but carrying easily through the hall's acoustics. "We're watching democracy work exactly as it's supposed to." He gestured toward the screen showing the social media explosion. 15 million people just watched an elected official tell another elected official to shut up, and then watched that official respond with facts, with story, with vision instead of insults. That's not just good television, that's the American experiment proving itself. The progressive section of the audience erupted again, but this time the energy spread further through the room. Even some business leaders were nodding appreciatively, recognizing effective communication when they saw it. Trump finally found his voice, though it lacked his usual commanding presence. "This is fake news metrics, probably manipulated by 16.2 million now," called out a different journalist, not looking up from her phone. "And climbing." Mamdani smiled, the expression both gracious and slightly mischievous. "Mr. President, with respect, you can't call live viewer counts fake news. Math doesn't have political affiliations." The laughter that rippled through the room was different from before, not hostile, but appreciative of the wit. Trump's tendency to dismiss inconvenient data had just been turned into a teaching moment about objective reality. "Let's talk about what's really happening here," Mamdani continued, moving closer to the center of the room again. His comfort level had grown with each exchange, while Trump seemed to be shrinking into himself. "We're witnessing the power of authentic communication in the digital age." He gestured toward the audience, including them in his analysis. "When I tell the story of my parents' struggle, millions of Americans recognize their own family's stories. When I talk about economic justice, people connect it to their own experiences of watching hard work go unrewarded while wealth accumulates at the top." The camera operators had unconsciously begun treating Mamdani as the center of the event, their lenses following his movement and gestures. Trump had become a supporting character in his own confrontation. "But here's what's most important," Mamdani said, his voice taking on the cadence of a teacher addressing a classroom. "This moment isn't about me versus him. It's about old versus new ways of doing politics." He turned toward Trump, his expression more sad than angry. "The old way says you attack the messenger when you can't attack the message. You question someone's patriotism when you can't question their facts. You demand silence when you can't win the argument." Margaret Chen leaned forward, sensing that the debate was reaching some kind of crescendo. "Assemblyman Mamdani, what would you say represents the new way?" "Engagement over intimidation," he replied immediately. "Evidence over emotion. Building bridges instead of burning them down." He walked closer to the panel table, his movements deliberate and confident. "The new way says that democracy gets stronger when more voices participate, not weaker. It says that good ideas can come from anyone, regardless of their age, their background, or their party affiliation. A notification chimed on the main screen again. The debate had just become the #1 trending topic in 47 countries. Hashtag economic justice was rising alongside hashtag #ShutUpCommunist, creating a dual narrative that political strategists would be analyzing for years. Trump made one last attempt to regain control of the narrative. This is all very pretty, but the American people want results, not speeches. They want someone who's actually run businesses, who understands. Let me stop you right there, Mamdani interrupted, his tone remaining respectful but firm. Because that's exactly the kind of false choice that got us into this mess. He began counting off on his fingers, each point deliberate and data-driven. You want to talk about running things? Let's talk about your administration's handling of the pandemic response. Let's talk about the national debt increase under your policies. Let's talk about which presidents oversaw the strongest job growth for working families. The statistics he rattled off were precise and devastating, delivered without malice but with the kind of factual authority that was impossible to dismiss. Trump's face grew redder with each number. The choice isn't between business experience and government experience, Mamdani continued. The choice is between competence and chaos, between policy and performance art, between leadership and showmanship. The room had grown completely silent except for the constant buzzing of phones and the soft clicking of camera shutters. Even the most ardent Trump supporters seemed to recognize that their champion was losing this exchange badly. Mamdani moved to what everyone sensed would be his closing argument. Mr. President, you asked me to shut up because you can't shut down my ideas. You called me a communist because you can't call my proposals wrong. He spread his arms wide, encompassing the entire room. But here's what you really accomplished today: you showed America that the future isn't afraid of the past. You showed them that facts matter more than volume, that dignity defeats derision, that hope is stronger than fear. The applause began before he finished speaking, building to another crescendo that seemed to shake the building's foundations. But Mamdani wasn't done. And you know what else you accomplished? He said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the growing ovation. You just launched a movement. Every time someone tries to silence debate with insults from now on, millions of Americans are going to remember this moment and say no. We deserve better. The social media notifications on the screen were coming too fast to read now. Hashtag We Deserve Better had just joined the trending topics. Political fundraising platforms were reporting surge traffic. University political science departments were already scheduling emergency seminars on the debate's implications. Trump stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that somehow seemed small in the vast space. Without a word, he began walking toward the exit, his security detail scrambling to keep up with his suddenly rapid pace. Mr. President, Mamdani called after him, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. Thank you again. You've given the American people exactly the clarity they needed. Trump paused at the door, his hand on the handle, his back to the room. For a moment, it seemed like he might turn around, might try one last counterattack. Instead, he pushed through the door and disappeared into the corridor beyond. The silence that followed was different from all the others, not shocked or reverent, but contemplative. Everyone present understood they had just witnessed something historic, though the full implications might not become clear for years. Margaret Chen finally managed to regain control of her event. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our panel discussion. Thank you for your attention but her words were drowned out by one final, sustained standing ovation. This time, even the journalists were on their feet, their professional objectivity temporarily overwhelmed by recognition of a masterful political performance. As the applause finally died down and people began filing out of the hall, Mamdani found himself surrounded by reporters, activists, and political operatives. His phone was already buzzing with interview requests, speaking invitations, and something that looked suspiciously like preliminary conversations about higher office. Through the crowd, he caught sight of Dorothy Martinez making her way toward the exit. Their eyes met across the room, and she nodded once, a small gesture that somehow contained more validation than all the applause and trending hashtags combined. The revolution, it seemed, had begun not with grand proclamations or dramatic gestures, but with simple dignity in the face of attempted intimidation. And it was being broadcast live to the world. 22 million viewers and counting.